All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Just want to say this has been a great workshop. I'm really honored to be a part of it. And it's been very educational, and hopefully we can keep the education going here with this presentation. So as introduced, I'm Greg Mazer. I'm with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Regulatory Division, and I'm based here in Fairbanks. And I'll talk for about 20 minutes or so about the Corps of Engineers permitting process in general, and as it relates to stream crossings. And then Bob Henszey will take over, talk about the services role in the permit process. Next slide, Bob. So start with jurisdiction. Jurisdiction under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which is the main authority driving the Corps of Engineers permitting process, includes truly navigable waters plus their tributaries, as well as territorial seas, lakes, mudflats, sloughs, and wetlands. And under Section 404, the extent of Corps jurisdiction in tidal waters extends to the high tide line, whereas in non-tidal waters, it extends to the ordinary high water mark. And when adjacent wetlands are present, the geographic limits extend to the delineated boundaries of the wetland. So as has been discussed in this workshop, ordinary high water mark is similar to bank full stage, but it's not quite the same. Both concepts rely on really the same set of field indicators, but it generally doesn't make a whole lot of difference with the permitting so much, and we will accept mapping of top of bank as an approximation of ordinary high water mark. If you wanted to get into more detail, there certainly is some guidance out there. In my opinion, the manual that's been written for the Western Mountains, Valleys, and Coast region for ordinary high water mark, which really covers the more humid portions of the Pacific Northwest and the Rocky Mountains, that appears to have very good applicability for small streams in Alaska. And just very recently, I think it was late last week, the Corps recently published a technical report called Field Guide to Identifying the Upper Extent of Stream Channels, and that probably should be helpful as well. Next slide. So discharge or placement of fill material in streams most often involves construction of roads and utilities, but it may stem from other types of activity. Fill placement may occur via mechanized land clearing, channelization, temporary stockpiling, that type of thing. And some of these discharges are actually exempt from Section 404 for certain agricultural and natural resource management activities, including the construction or maintenance of farm roads, roads for forestry operations, or temporary roads for moving mining equipment. However, there is criteria that must be met, essentially that some best management practices that assure that the flow and circulation patterns are maintained and that the chemical and biological characteristics of the waters are not impaired. Next slide. So there are two main types of permits issued by the Corps. They're general permits and individual permits. Now, general permits include both nationwide permits and regional general permits, and only authorize certain activities that have minimal individual and cumulative impacts to jurisdictional waters. These are programmatic permits and are typically issued every 5 years, and they generally last for 5 years. Prior to their expiration, the Corps reviews the applicability of each general permit with assistance from interagency coordination and public comment. And we determine whether they should be reissued, retired, or modified. Regional general permits are issued district by district, and regional general permits issued in the Alaska district, as we call it, and that covers the entire state, include those that authorize specific activity statewide and others that are specific to certain regions of the state. Individual permits are mainly issued as standard individual permits, which are for activities that would have more than minimal impact to waters of the United States. And individual permits involve a comprehensive review of proposed activities, and includes coordination with other resource agencies, and requires issuance of a public notice describing the activity and the dates of the comment period, which typically lasts 30 days and allows the public to weigh in on the proposal. The other type of individual permit is called a letter of permission, and LOPs are for minor work in navigable waters and are generally not used for stream crossings. Processing time for general permits is typically 45 to 60 days, whereas that of individual permits is 120 days or more. And this difference in processing time incentivizes project proponents to reduce the adverse effects of their planned activities so that they may qualify for authorization under a general permit. And I've got the Alaska District Regulatory website shown there. It's not a hyperlink, but it's got good information. The website's good information about permitting in general, as well as application forms, sample drawings, and other guidance. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the, the nationwide permit process, which by one metric, it comprises about 97% of our workload. And that, as I described previously, it's a more streamlined permit process than the individual permit process. So prior to submitting an application, it's generally helpful to contact the Corps to discuss planned activity and determine the appropriate type of permit. There's several different types of nationwide permits, and the type of information that would be needed to complete the review. Applications can be in the form of a full-on individual permit application, or a kind of a consolidated reduced version that's specific to nationwide permits called a pre-construction notification. Applications or notifications are required for many nationwide permits, but not all. The Corps often receives applications or notifications for projects that don't really require it, but our review may provide assurance to the applicant that their proposed project has no more than minimal impacts and does indeed comply with the requirements of the appropriate nationwide permit. Now, once a complete application or notification is submitted, the permit process begins with a jurisdictional determination, where we determine whether the waters that would be affected are actually regulated under the Clean Water Act. Certain types are not. For both the jurisdictional determination and the impact assessment, we review a variety of databases for information about the aquatic resources, including whether the waters involved may be designated as essential fish habitat or support species listed under the Endangered Species Act, and whether there are other resources in the project vicinity that are legally protected, such as historic sites eligible for listing by the National Register of Historic Places. We reach out to other resource agencies for their input, and such coordination may lead to a more extended review or recommendations that lead to conditions being placed on the permit to avoid or minimize impacts to the resources in question. The end result is typically a verification letter sent to the project proponent with a copy of the nationwide permit that applies to the project and a list of the applicable permit conditions. Alternatively, application review and agency coordination may result in the Corps asking for more information to complete the review, or it may result in the Corps asserting discretionary authority to require review via the individual permit process. Next slide. So the Section 404B1 guidelines and their criteria must be followed before any discharge is authorized. And one criterion of the guidelines leads to mitigation, which is a key part of the permit process, and is really a sequence of 3 steps known as avoidance, minimization, and compensation. Avoidance is typically accomplished through delineation of aquatic resources and careful project layout. And for stream crossing projects, it could be accomplished through directional drilling. Minimization involves reducing a project's footprint where it encounters jurisdictional waters, but it also translates to reducing the intensity and geographic extent of any secondary impacts or indirect impacts. And those are impacts that occur away from the project site and or occur after the regulated activity is complete. This aspect of minimization entails following best management practices or conditions placed upon a permit, and they often serve to ensure that the activity will minimize erosion and sedimentation and maintain hydrologic connectivity. So for stream crossings, minimization may come in the form of a proposal for a stream simulation design structure versus a conventional culvert. And compensation or compensatory mitigation is the final step, and that offsets losses that remain after all appropriate and practicable avoidance and minimization has been achieved. Often regulated activities are designed with a sufficient level of minimization such that no compensatory mitigation is necessary. Next slide. So as you may know, the 2017 nationwide permits have expired and a new set of nationwide permits have been issued in their place. This recent replacement was a bit off schedule, as nationwide permits are typically issued every 5 years. The replacement occurred in 2 phases. The first phase was in January of 2021. And the second phase occurred just this past December. And that second set just went into effect February 25th of this year. So now there are 57 nationwide permits total now. 52 were pre-existing, and there are 5 new ones. And though they were released at different times, they will all expire on March 14th, 2026. Now note that there are 57 nationwide permits in total, but they number from 1 through 59, as there is no nationwide permit 26 or 47. All right, on to the next slide. Thanks, Bob. So one major change that occurred with reissuance is that the units of measurement used for quantifying impacts to streams is no longer in linear feet and is now only in acres. The 300-foot limit for 10 nationwide permits has been removed, and the maximum amount of stream impact area for these regulated activities, which range from residential development permitted by nationwide permit 29 to mining activities, nationwide permit 44, to land-based renewable energy generation facilities, nationwide permit 51, is now a half an acre. Additionally, general condition 32 was modified to remove the requirement to submit a pre-construction notification or application for proposed impacts for more than 300 feet of stream. In removing the 300-foot limit, the Corps intends to rely on the half-acre limit and other requirements to ensure that activities authorized by nationwide permits will result in no more than minimal adverse environmental effect. Note that this change does not apply to either nationwide permit 13, bank stabilization, or nationwide permit 54, living shorelines, which continue to have a 500-foot limit and the potential to waive these limits if the Corps determines that, that exceeding those limits would have no more than a minimal adverse effect. Next slide. So here are a few nationwide permits that are typically used for stream crossings. Nationwide 14 linear transportation projects is probably by far the most common. This permit allows for up to 1/2 acre of impact to non-tidal jurisdictional waters or no more than 1/3 of an acre impact to tidal waters for the construction or modification of roads, trails, runways, etc. As part of the recent changes with the nationwide permit reissuance, the Corps essentially split nationwide 12, which had been for utilities. We split it up into 3 permits. Nationwide 12 is now only for oil or gas pipeline activities. And there are two new nationwide permits. There's nationwide permit 57 for electric utility line and telecommunications activities, and 58 for utility line activities for water and other substances. There are some subtle differences between these permits, but they all have the half-acre impact limit. And then there's nationwide permit 29 and 39, and these continue to have the half-acre limit. So yeah, next slide. I wanted to also mention nationwide permit 13, bank stabilization, as this is sometimes used in association with stream crossings, or it's used on its own as a means to control stream bank erosion or prevent a stream's lateral migration. And this permit requires that bioengineering and natural materials be used to the maximum extent practicable. And there's some additional criteria that I've listed there, including that 500-foot limit and the limit to the amount of cubic yardage that can be placed per linear foot. But those two criteria may be waived if it's determined that there be no adverse effect on the aquatic environment. And in fact, for root wad projects, I think that one cubic yard of material per linear foot is often met or just barely exceeded. Next slide, please. So of the 32 general conditions that apply to nationwide permits, there are 3 that are most relevant to stream crossings. And they are General Condition 2, which states that no activity may substantially disrupt the life cycle of movements of aquatic species unless the project's primary purpose is to impound water. General Condition 3, which essentially prohibits discharge of fill in spawning areas during spawning seasons, at least, but activities that result in physical destruction through excavation, fill, or downstream smothering by substantial turbidity of important spawning areas are not authorized. And then there's General Condition 9, which states that the precondition, course, condition, capacity, and location of open waters must be maintained unless alterations to these factors are shown to benefit the aquatic environment, as in with stream restoration or relocation. Next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, we got them. Okay, a little bit of a delay. So the regional conditions on nationwide permits are issued district by district, and there are 4 regional conditions in the Alaska district that apply to stream crossings. Regional condition B has some varied requirements for certain nationwide permits, and as had been in place previously, an application or pre-construction notification is required for bank stabilization projects if they will not abide or will not follow the techniques described in the Stream Bank Revegetation and Protection, a Guide for Alaska. And then there's regional condition C regarding trenching, and trenching may not be constructed, or trenches may not be constructed or backfilled in a way that would drain waters, and the backfilled trench must be returned to pre-construction elevations within a year. And then there's F, maintenance of hydrology patterns, which just states that natural drainage patterns shall be maintained. And regional condition J, which applies to those 10 nationwide permits for which the 300-foot limit was removed. And it states that the project must not involve placing fill in anadromous streams or waters, including wetlands adjacent to or upstream of anadromous water bodies. Okay, next slide. So we talked about general conditions and regional conditions, and there are also special conditions. And those are applied ad hoc and can be applied to any type of permit and may be used to constrain the nature or timing of the proposed activity, or may be used to set compensatory mitigation requirements, including performance standards that must be met for the mitigation to be considered satisfactory. Special conditions are often based on recommendations made by coordinating agencies, such as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Next slide. Lastly, I just want to talk about the stream quantification tool, which Will Harmon helped to develop, and he discussed on Tuesday. And really, this tool was developed to improve understanding of functions of wadable streams and to guide the efforts to conserve and restore these streams. The SQT is essentially a functions assessment for streams and may be used to quantify anticipated functional loss from proposed impacts or to quantify anticipated functional gain from restoration or enhancement. The use of the SQT is not required in the Alaska District or really in anywhere in the nation, but it is recognized as a relatively rapid, scientifically defensible method. And the Alaska District's supported development of the SQT for the interior, and we are currently supporting development of the SQT for the Arctic coastal plain. Bob Henszey of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been a key player in these developments. And I'll now pass the mic over to him to discuss the role that the Fish and Wildlife Service plays in the permitting process.
Okay, thank you, Greg. I appreciate you staying on at the end of the day. I have about 14 more minutes of slides to go through, so I hope you have the time to listen. And I think Heather said this is going to be recorded, so if you really do have to step out at 2:30, the remaining part of my presentation will be available on slide. I'm going to turn off my video because apparently there's a little bit of delay. Video, stopped. I'm going to talk about the Fish and Wildlife Service's role as a technical expert to the Corps of Engineers. In most cases, we do not actually issue a permit for stream crossings. We may issue permits from other authorities that we have, but not for an actual stream crossing as a stream crossing. It's important to recognize that we are the only federal agency whose primary responsibility is the conservation and maintenance of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the American people. And I work for a branch of the Fish and Wildlife Service called Conservation Planning Assistance. And our mission is to work collaboratively with the project sponsor, the permitting agencies, in a way to develop their projects in such a way that it meets their goals as well as sustainable and compatible with the conservation of fish, wildlife, and their habitats. We operate under a number of authorities. Jenny touched on a few, Greg touched on a few, and I will touch on some more in a little bit more detail on how they relate to our actual comments that we make for the Corps of Engineers. The first half of these are the ones that are primarily the ones that we talk about, and I'll talk about them in a little more detail here later, including starting off with the kind of the granddaddy of all the Fish and Wildlife Acts. It's the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. And that establishes fish and wildlife as a co-equal objective of all federally funded permitted, that would be like a Corps permit, or a licensed water development project. It allows federal agencies that are developing such projects to, it actually doesn't allow it, requires them to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and in some cases, the National Marine Fisheries Service and the states regarding fish and wildlife habitat. It also allows us to make mitigation recommendations, and that's avoidance, minimization, and compensation recommendations for a broad set of habitats in fish and wildlife, and these go beyond what are covered by some of the more specific resource laws. The Clean Water Act, which is the one that the Corps primarily operates under for stream crossings, right up at the very top of the Clean Water Act, it recognizes fish propagation and protection for fish, shellfish, and wildlife. So right up at the very top of the Clean Water Act, we recognize this fish and habitat, or fish and wildlife. The actual statute says the service will submit any comments in writing to the Secretary of the Army, which means that my folks will provide comments to Greg's folks in formal letters. The actual regulations say that we can make factual comments on a whole host of fish and wildlife things, including threatened and endangered species, fish, crustaceans, mollusks, other aquatic organisms in the food web, other wildlife, and I could go on, but basically it just gives us authority to comment on anything that's fish and wildlife habitat related. Opportunities for comment, and I can't stress this any more than this, is it's the best time to comment as soon as you hear about a particular project, before permitting, ideally, because that's when the project sponsors are considering their plans, working on budgets, and working on other things. By the time it gets to the permitting stage, such as individual permits like Greg was talking about, they already have everything in place. So during that 30-day public notice period, which we're allowed to comment at the same time the public does, the applicant may already be getting his equipment mobilized and ready to go out on the job. And they really don't want to hear from the Fish and Wildlife Service saying, hey, wait a minute, what about floodplain connectivity? So I recommend getting involved as soon as you can when you hear about a project. Greg talked about nationwide permits and regional general permits. These have their conditions set in place for 5 years, and the only opportunity to comment for those is when they expire. And the next time they expire is in 2026. And that's the time for agencies as well as the public to come in and say, we would like to see these changes for these particular permits. And then there's one other way that agencies, including state and federal agencies, can comment. That used to be called the GPAC, or General Permit Agency Coordination, where the Corps would notify the agencies and give them 10 to 15 days to say they have some concerns and provide comments. That it's now been changed to, I guess, what they're calling an agency notification email. And we still get a notification, but instead of the Corps waiting those 10 to 15 days, they continue on with the process. But they're willing to listen to our comments if we let them know we're going to provide comments. And the types of recommendations we make, well, it's pretty obvious that fish need water. So that's not really much of a problem. And the fish habitat, or the Alaska Fish and Game does a pretty good job of that. And I'm really pleased to hear that they recognize that their guidelines and requirements are a little bit out of date, and they're working on those. But we also recognize that in addition to fish, there are a lot of other functions in stream crossings that we would like to see. And that's where we recommend the culvert design guidelines that Heather's been updating and really improve that, along with Bill Rice's initial work on this. Wildlife habitat is one of the main features that we comment on in addition to fish, and it's pretty easy to comment on the larger, more charismatic mammals that you can see, such as moose and beaver. But as we learned on the first day, riparian and floodplain habitats also provide habitat. And in fact, there's some studies that say that's the richest habitat in Alaska. And what lives in those habitats is some fairly secretive birds, migratory birds that literally fly thousands of miles up to Alaska just to breed. And just because we don't see them doesn't mean they're not depending upon that habitat. Jenny touched on the Endangered Species Act, and I'd just like to emphasize to go to our, let me find my mouse, there we go, to our ECOS site, and it's now called Ecosphere. And by the way, I just learned this when Jenny was giving the presentation that my link is out of date, but I just checked it, it still works. You know, I'll fix that after the presentation. But the key word is if you search for IPAC and Fish and Wildlife Service, that'll come up. Jenny also talked about the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And one part that I really want to stress is it not only protects eagles, but it also protects their nests year round. Even when the nest is not being used, that nest is protected. So if the tree is in the way of your project, you'll need to talk to our permitting folks and see what requirements they would ask you to do before removing that eagle nest. And then the Migratory Bird Treaty Act covers all the birds, all the migratory bird species, which is almost all the birds in Alaska. And the best management practice that we have come up with, it seems to work the best, is to do your work either before or after the breeding season, or if you do it before, make the site unsuitable for nesting habitat. That could be removing the vegetation beforehand or laying a layer of gravel down on top of the tundra on the north slope, something like that. We put together this, and Jenny referred to this too, is our timing recommendations for when not to disturb vegetation or the ground during the nesting season. It lists several habitat types across the top here in regions in Alaska. And then these are the general breeding or nesting dates in the various areas in Alaska. And these are just guidelines, they're not enforceable. They're recommendations that if you follow these dates, more than likely you'll be in compliance with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. When I first saw this figure, I thought, this is great. This is what I've been thinking all along, and you've seen it several times now over the week. And when we make recommendations, we would prefer to have a full span crossing across the entire floodplain, but we also recognize that's expensive and sometimes difficult to do. So even a full span crossing across a bankful habitat would help. We certainly don't recommend down here at the very bottom, which is just enough culvert design to pass water. And if you had to choose which one of these designs would fail during a high water, excessive high water event, it would probably be this cheaper one. So in the long run, it may not be cheaper. Another option to do when you can't do a full span crossing is to install floodplain culverts, including some of the side channels or high flow channels, and account for that. That sort of works, but you can end up with water backing up behind these and causing sediment on this side. And this, you have concentrated flow coming out of these culverts. So you don't really get the spread across the floodplain on some of the wider floodplains unless you add lots of culverts, floodplain culverts. You've heard a couple of times, or more than a couple of times now, about the stream quantification tool for the interior. Well, it also has a debit calculator that recognizes the impacted functions from various ways of crossing streams. Everything from a full span crossing across the floodplain, which would be at tier 0 or 0 impacts or nearly 0 impacts, to a full span bridge with abutments in the floodplain, and that has some impacts, all the way down to where the culvert is just passing water, and that has the most impacts, and that is rated as a tier 5. So now I have a few slides to show or figures to show, and I would strongly recommend when you provide comments to the Corps or any other permitting agency to show your comments in figures, because this really gets the point across. So when we say we would like a full span crossing across the floodplain, well, this is what we're saying. So a figure like this would get that across. We also recognize that they may not be able to do that, so we would recommend at least a full span crossing across the channel. This has more impacts though, so you've got to keep that in mind. And then, so why is this important? Well, I've been looking at this for years, and I finally took the time to actually look at it through a time sequence. This is Phalen Creek in the Alaska Range on the Richardson Highway, about milepost 205. It's a glacier-fed stream, highly braided channel. And there was a proposal years ago to put a crossing across this. It's about 1,900 feet across. Notice the thalweg is over here. We had some discussions about choosing where to put the thalweg. Well, they chose to put their full span bridge right where the thalweg was. But notice now that the channel is moved, or the main part of the flowing water is moved over to the other side of the valley. It is now running into this embankment and is being directed over to the bridge to go across. At the same time, we've got accretion on the upstream side when there's high water and it deposits water up on this side. And on the downstream side, there's no longer any water to move this material. So that ends up with accretion there. Sometimes that might be good habitat. It might create some temporary riparian habitat that's great for migratory birds. But it's not always great. I worked on the Platte River in Nebraska where sandhill cranes nest in habitat similar to this overnight, not nest, I knew I was going to say that. They roost overnight in the shallow standing water of the Platte River. And this would be a complete elimination of that particular habitat. Greg also mentioned special permit conditions. We can recommend special permit conditions. In this case, this is a special permit recommendation that we made that said stream crossings shall preserve floodplain connectivity to the greatest extent. And we said possible. And the Corps looked at it and said, that's great. I think we'll use it, except for they tweaked our language a little bit and changed the wording to the greatest extent practicable, which it has a legal term that I think includes also the cost of doing so. So possible with the cost included. So finally, we are very receptive to the opportunity to provide technical assistance. The Heather is available in the southern area of the state, and I work with Mitch Osborne in the northern part of the state. And Mitch works directly with Heather quite often for the projects we have up here. So please give us a call at any time and we'll be happy to help you. With that, I'll open it up to any questions you may have.